In the last episode of the podcast, we were talking about The Wild Great Wall, a collection of poetry by Zhu Zhu, translated by Dong Li. Well, exciting news for this episode. Pretty much the whole thing is me interviewing Dong Li, and I learned some amazing things, like how he found himself in the desert. But before we can get to the interview, I'd just like to do my plugs. So, first of all, if you want the latest news on the podcast, the Instagram is the best place to go. It's at TrChFic, TrChFic, for of course translated Chinese fiction. You'll find out what the next episode will be about on there ahead of time, which is always fun, and I also share fun wee nuggets there as well. The other thing I'd like to plug is the Patreon I've opened for the show. Basically, because I'm paying about £100 a year to get my SoundCloud hosting, and you know, I'm not a rich man, so if you'd like to set up a monthly recurring donation to the show, you can get a shout out for yourself for $2 a month. If you give $20, I'll just let you dictate any episode topic you like. I'm also probably going to open up a PayPal so you can make a one-off donation rather than a monthly one. Obviously, if you can't afford to contribute to the show, don't. Just enjoy the episodes. The whole point of podcasts is they're free. So without further ado, let's get on with the show. Here's the interview I had with the amazing Dong Li. Hey everybody, we've got Dong Li on the show. He's the translator of Zhu Zhu's collection of poetry, The Wild Great Wall. So really excited to have you on. Dong, would you like to tell us some things about yourself before we get started?
So right now I'm based in Germany, and we have good weather after a cold spell last week. So the weather is beautiful, and and I'm sort of an English language poet, but also I translate from 3 languages, from the Chinese, from English, and from German.
Cool. So how long have you been translating for now? Professionally, I mean.
Professionally, I don't know whether I would call it professionally, right?
Yeah, tricky word.
So I think it's after I started to write in English, like seriously, in the States. I spent almost 10 years in the States, and as I was sort of doing my master's in fine arts, and I started to translate. That was the time I sort of picked up translation, and first with literary translation, and then I've also done my professional translations as well.
Cool. So what brought you to the States, and what inspired you to start writing in English then?
I think it's sort of it's both complicated. The question is both complicated and easy.
Right.
So I had a scholarship. I was already studying in Beijing for a couple of years, and I was not very happy with the courses, and so I applied to study in the States. And as a transfer student, it was very difficult to get a scholarship, so I sort of applied to start over in the States. And still it was sort of difficult, but I was able to get a scholarship from a sort of unique college in the middle of the desert in California.
Oh.
It's called Deep Springs College, and so I got a scholarship, and I think it was really in the desert. I really got close to sort of poetry. I think it's the desert. I think really it's the desert that gave me a sort of voice, because it's a very close-knit community with only 26 students, all male, and the school just turned co-ed last year, and but it's been a sort of educational experiment for over 100 years. So it's sort of been there for a long time in the desert, sort of unknown outside of the United States, and so that's where I really picked up English and did a lot of philosophy and milked cows, and it's also a cattle ranch, so every student has like manual duties on campus. So,
that's amazing.
Yeah, so that was a really cool experience. So you're really in the American West, and you're milking cows and, trying to do this social experiment, and in the middle of nowhere. And the valley is about like an hour away from a village, Bishop. So it's really in the middle of nowhere. You need like an hour to get to the closest town. So I think that isolation also helps quite a bit. So I think writing became a way of expressing myself, and I think I picked up English because it it gives me a little bit of distance from the experiences that I had, because I think the poetic act, or writing itself, is pretty reflective, and I think with some distance, and then you're dealing with, I was dealing with some Chinese materials, and using English, I think it opens up some kind of possibilities, and yeah, that's how it sort of began.
That's an amazing story. So when I was looking for things to talk about in the episode about the Wild Great Wall, so I was looking for information about yourself and also Zhu Zhu, and just from reading your author bio, I would never have guessed that you'd done all that stuff in the desert. That's amazing. So next question. These days, what do you read for fun? Or if fun's too frivolous a word, what do you read for pleasure?
I read a lot of German stuff for fun, and also for because sort of I've been living in this country for quite a few years now, and I'm picking up the language, and also teach a translation class at a university from German to Chinese. So I do read for classes, but I also read a lot of German poetry. I picked up, and also I read French. So I also read French authors really for fun. That's sort of meditative for me. I love France, and I've been to France a lot of times, and I still sort of love that kind of the language and the literature. And so now in Germany, I'm reading a little bit of more French literature for fun.
Yeah, that was something I know that you didn't write The Wild Great Wall, but I remember noticing as I was reading through that a lot of the references to Western things were continental European things. So it seems like that's right up your alley.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, I think in the last episode you mentioned the Baudelaire quote, right? So I thought, wow, that's a really famous poem I recited before, and so I just used the French version. I thought that would be fun to have the original instead of an English translation, and then you sort of have to explain, right, what that which English translation should be the one to put on, and so forth. I thought, okay, I'll just put on the original.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting choice. So, jumping forward a wee bit to the Wild Great Wall and Zhu Zhu. So I know that the article you put on World Literature Today talked a wee bit about how you guys first kind of connected, but I wanted to know how long had you been reading his poetry before you reached out to him?
I think it was sort of, I think it was in grad school. I was doing this master's on arts and creative writing, and I was writing my own poems in English, and I was sort of also translating quite a bit of authors. And no, actually it was before that. I did my undergrad in comparative literature, and I did a thesis on translating Chinese poetry. So at that time I was looking at authors, and I was sort of pretty struck by Zhu Zhu's brilliance at the time. I thought very different from the other authors, especially the authors who've been known in the U.S., like the Mengnon, the Misty school poets, or the Mengnon school poets. Been known in the West for quite a while, and for political or ideological reasons, or for their own poetic merits.
Yeah,
I thought Zhu Zhu is sort of quite interesting. It was also quite a challenge to translate him, and so I showed some of my early translations to one of the professors there, and that professor was saying, "Oh, maybe it's not the right or the perfect poet to translate, right?" Because I think people already have, people in the literary translation world, they already have this sort of perception or an idea of how Chinese poetry should sound,
right,
and should be like, and what kind of themes they should touch on. And I think Zhu Zhu was sort of a little bit different at the time. That was already quite a few years ago. That was probably 2011, 2010, around 2010, 29, I would say. And so I was sort of challenged I thought, okay, I'll make it work. So
Good for you.
Yeah. So, and then got in touch with him, and it was a little bit difficult because he's kind of a reserved person, and the presses in China, they are very hard to get in touch, and they don't forward your information or your calls to authors. So it took me a little bit to get his phone number, and then I got him on the phone, and he was sort of a little bit skeptical at first, right? Because this is guy only from the middle of nowhere from the U.S. and calling me and wanting to translate my poetry. Of course, I understand, and also translating it into English, which is not my mother tongue. So of course, I totally understand.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's the magic of the internet. Two people can kind of just throw out a line without having to necessarily go through person A, A, B, or C. What was I going? Oh yes, so what you said about the kind of the resistance you met in the States about translating Zhu Zhu because he was a bit different. I think I might have an idea what your answer might be, but I'm not certain. So what do you think sets Zhu Zhu apart from other Chinese poets who are known in the West or in the English-speaking world? What's different about him?
I think it's a sort of, I think it's a super complicated issue, and I think the so-called exiled poets, I don't necessarily think all their poems touch on the issues of exile or their poems are political. But I think there are some ideological issues behind that. Mm-hmm. And I think for him, I think he's just concerned about his own poetics too. Sometimes I would say also a little bit solipsistic. I would say he's very much concerned with his own poetics. And I think that to some extent, it's also another way of doing Chinese poetry. It's just slightly different than the Mono school poets or the second generation of Mono school poets or the more academic poets or poets who are working academia. I think he's just a little bit different, a little bit of an outsider. He's not really in the scene in China at the time, but now he's sort of more and more visible in Chinese poetry, but at the time I don't think he was very much in the scene. He wasn't invited to a lot of poetry festivals or conferences and stuff. So he's not really in the mainstream. And even though he had sort of a couple prizes, I think earlier in his career, and then it sort of stopped because I think he earned his bread by doing curation of art shows and stuff, and also by doing art criticism. So he was, slightly going off the grid for a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So I remember in my podcast I mentioned the word exile that pops up in the poems a few times, and you mentioned exiled poets in one of your answers. So perhaps for my benefit and the listeners' benefit, what would you call an exiled Chinese poet? And is Zhu Zhu, is he himself an exile, in your opinion?
I think for me, every poet is exiled before he or she finds the language, right? I think that's everybody is exiled to from an aesthetic point of view. Every poet is exiled before he or she finds the language for certain material. I think the normal conception of an exiled Chinese poet is someone who's sort of living, who went through political persecution and then went overseas, right? I think that's the common conception of what an exiled Chinese poet is, and or those who are still living abroad. And but Zhu Zhu, I think he's also exiled, but it's a kind of different exile, more like internal exile, because he's still living in China, working in China, and thriving in China, I think. And I think his exile is more internal. I think exile from peers, from his from the predominant poetic language at the time, and to that extent, I think he's sort of exiled, and that he's having that internal exile. but overseas, he's also, he's been traveling quite a bit overseas and becoming international. That's also a kind of exile, right? Because the communication is still difficult, and he's not a super political poet, and he does not claim, to be a politically exiled poet, right? So he does not write about politics directly or about that, that period. And so I think he has this sort of double internal but also external, internal exile, in his home country, but also external exile whenever he's traveling overseas.
Yeah, I suppose that's the cost of doing things your own way.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting answer. So here's a question about yourself. When you were putting together the Wild Great Wall, were you trying to put together kind of a whole picture of all of Zhu Zhu's poetry? Or were you picking from his poetry selectively to build a particular feeling or a particular kind of collection?
So I was able to do the selection when Zhu Zhu and I, we got a fellowship at the Vermont Studio Center. This is artist colony in the U.S. in Vermont, and they started in 2013 a fellowship for Chinese poets and translators of Chinese poetry. So we got a grant to have this residency together. So at that time we sort of started to talk about putting together a book, and so I think the selection was easier for me, and even though I had some kind of resistance from Zhu Zhu himself, I just picked all the poems that I liked, and I let Zhu Zhu strike out the poems that he did not like, and then of course, and then we sort of, I was trying to put the poems that we both liked together, and trying to find an arc. And then I thought maybe we'll just do the, chronology. I think that would be sort of easiest and also clear, because I think for Zhu Zhu, I think it's pretty clear, those 4 periods. I think how his poetics has evolved and developed in those 4 periods.
Yeah. So because I only read through it once, I could feel a progression in maybe the places he was going to and from, but I think if you were to go, for someone who didn't know the man himself, you might have to go back and read a few times to see the changes. But do you know anything in his life that kind of made those 4? It's 4 periods, isn't it? It's not 5.
4.
Yeah. Is there any life events that split those things apart, or was it all kind of internal poetic stuff?
I think in the first period, I think he was writing really isolated. He was super isolated, and he was teaching teaching law, I think, at a university in Shanghai.
Interesting.
And then he quit his job. He quit his job at the university to pursue writing, and it was quite difficult, to make your living by writing or writing poetry and so forth. And so in the first period, I think these poems are more ethereal. These are sort of these internal exile poems. And sort of my understanding of it, even though there's a lot of, he's reading furiously at that time. I think that also helped to cure his loneliness at the time.
Right.
He didn't have a lot of friends. So even during that time, his reading was quite broad. That's why there were like François Villon and Swedish friends and so forth. And that's from that period. The second period, when I think he made a name by writing art criticism, and he moved to Beijing to become an art curator, and he has been quite successful. And at that time, I think history really slowly comes into play in his poem. I think during that period was more like the Blue Smoke, the Wild Great Wall, and Small Town, and so forth. Not necessarily that he's writing about Beijing, but I think history slowly enters into play. during that period. And then the third one, I think it's really the history is loaded with history and historical references, historical narratives. And that's also a period when he's I think his outlook is becoming more international, and a lot of travels, and he was invited to France and to attend poetry festival, and I mean he's been influenced by French modernist poetry, by Baudelaire and so forth, and that would be that period. And the last period, I think that's he's becoming more outspoken, I would say. I think you referenced Florence, the poem Florence in your last podcast, and he was saying, okay, I mean, normally he's not so straightforward. I would say Zhu Zhu is not really a straightforward poet, and he's been pretty straightforward, adamant about, why should Chinese poets all write political poetry for a Western audience, right?
Yeah.
And they should also be able to, write about beauty and truth, the way they see it. I think that's the more outspoken period, even though most of the poems written during that period weren't that, outspoken, except this one.
Yeah, I suppose that's a wee irony that in saying, listen, I shouldn't have to be political, he's actually going from being not political at all to kind of indirectly political.
Yeah, that's his political gesture, because to some extent, if you're speaking for the poets or for yourself or for poetry, and you're saying, okay, why should Chinese poets? So I think that's already a political stance there you're proposing.
Sure. Okay, so another question about yourself and your translation is just which parts of the translation did you find the hardest, and what things were a lot easier?
I think it's all very difficult. I think I'm a perfectionist, so I fail quite a bit, and I always fail, and I'm still embarrassed by all my translations. So it's kind of hard to say, and I don't have a favorite poem, right? I don't have a favorite translation, but I do find the rhythm. It's hard to translate Zhu Zhu's rhythm. I think it's not the words and so forth. I think it's the rhythm. He has a meandering, prosy rhythm in his poems, even though there are passionate bursts,
right?
In between. I think it's those rhythms that are really hard to capture. I think it's also his tone is, his tone comes throughout, out from those rhythms. So I think I was having a bit of hard time capturing those rhythms. I think that's probably the hardest part to capture, especially in those more prosy poems.
Okay. Makes sense. I mean, it's hard for me to... Of course, I've only read the English translation, so it's hard for me to understand that one. But yeah, I can kind of imagine. So there was one word that I kind of waffled about in my podcast. It was south of Yangtze, which I checked was a translation of Jiangnan. I think I mentioned on the podcast that was a word I learned when I was living in Shanghai, reflecting on the places I lived in China, which was Shanghai, Zhejiang, and the places I've traveled, which were mostly Zhejiang and Jiangsu.
Mm-hmm.
So Jiangnan was a word that was on my mind fairly often. Anyway, was your translation to south of Yangtze, was that one that you felt was one of the trickier things, or do you think that's a fairly straightforward translation?
I still feel that maybe I could do better, right? Because I cannot
yeah.
the time. I think it's a hard one because the title is like a republic, right? Jiangnan Gonghe
Right.
Guo.
Yeah,
So Jiangnan Republic. So you have to make Jiangnan into a place, into sort of a proper noun. So I just, took the easiest route and make it into south of Yangtze, because I think Yangtze conjures up some kind of images of China. It's actually, Jiangnan also refers to the Yangtze Delta geographically, right?
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily want to use Yangtze Delta, a republic, but that sounds right?
No, that sounds awful.
And then a republic, which is sort of political, and I feel South of Yangtze, I think it could just do a very straightforward literal translation probably would do in this case, because I really could not find a better translation.
Exactly.
Because if you do like Jiangnan, then they have, anybody who's reading in English would not have any idea what that is.
Exactly, yeah.
Name. But with the Yangtze, I think that really helps a little bit. South of Yangtze, they can imagine that's a place south of Yangtze, and then a republic. Okay, that's sort of maybe a metaphorical republic. So I thought, okay, maybe, but that's tricky. You're right, that's a tricky one.
Yeah, were you tempted to leave a footnote for that one explaining what Jiangnan might mean, or would that have just been too ridiculous?
I intentionally didn't want to leave a footnote because I feel like, because in that poem, Jiangnan 共和国, south of Yangtze Republic, I think that this essentially, it has this historical allusion to Jiangnan, right? This place. I feel like it's making it metaphorical. So I thought, okay, it's better not to leave a footnote. If people are interested, they could look it up. They could know the historical references. I just want to leave it a little bit more open.
Yeah, I feel that's one kind of fun thing about living in this day and age is if you see a word you don't recognize in a book, whether it's a translated book or not, if you've got a smartphone in your pocket, you can just pop the word into Google and then see what Google tells you.
Yeah, exactly. I think books come from books, right? Words come from other words. I think that would be my, I think that's a great thing to have and to do, is really to let readers to go to other words, other places, other books. This book should be an invitation to other books.
Yeah, absolutely. That's some of the best books I've read have been just named in other books, or have been kind of tangential rather than things I've, I don't know, been given for Christmas or found in a bestsellers list. Anyway, moving on to an almost completely different question.
Sure.
Are you a member of any Chinese to English or English to Chinese translation groups, or any other different organizations or associations of translators?
I work with, so I'm sort of, I'm not an official member because, but I won a sort of Panheim grant from Pan America. Mm-hmm. So for my translation of not Zhu Zhu, but another Chinese poet only. And so I won a translation grant in 2015 for translating the Chinese poetry only. That's also why that's also why I was able to publish this book with Phone in Media. That's sort of the behind-the-scenes story. Because at the time, he was the founder of the publishing house, Phone in Media. He contacted me asking for my manuscript. But at that time, after I won the award, the manuscript of the other Chinese poet was not completed yet. So I said, okay, I have this manuscript ready from Zhu Zhu. Would you like to take a look? So that's, anyways, so I'm actually, in the Pan network. And also, recently I've been working with Pathlight, so Paper Republic, which is
awesome.
With Eric and with Jeremy. Jeremy and Eric both are fabulous translators from the Chinese. Mm-hmm. And so I do work for them as well. So,
I managed to sit down with Jeremy at the London Book Fair, and he's really funny. He made me laugh.
I have not met him personally yet, but we've been corresponding a lot via email.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and me being this absolute junior who is not a translator myself, I just did try not to say anything stupid in case I made myself look like a fool. But that's cool, because all the research I've been doing for my studies, a lot of it seems to point back to Paper Republic. And all the reading I was doing about you, it kind of seemed like you were kind of floating out there on your own. So it's cool to know that you're part of that organization.
If not like as an official member, because I still like my independence. I like working for them on a case-by-case basis, right? So if they have a piece of poems or a piece of fiction or short story they will send it onto me, and I'll take a look whether I could do it or not. And but I enjoy working with them. I mean, we also have other great translators who are also like editors, like Eleanor Goodman. She's an editor for Life, and she's also been great.
Awesome. So speaking of being a little bit of a lone wolf, what's it like doing your work in Germany and in mainland European languages rather than residing in, say, the US or the UK and strictly doing English and Chinese, Chinese and English?
I think it's a personal choice. Of course, that personal choice also, comes at a cost. And I do love the French and German languages, and I started to learn French and German in the States. And I was able to spend some time with a couple of scholarships in Europe. And I feel like I have some sort of a basic grip of the English language up to now. And I feel like I want to expand myself. So I've been writing quite a bit in English and translating quite a bit. I thought, okay, and also at that time I got 2 scholarships. And there was also a personal note to it, actually. So I was, after my MFA, I got a fellowship, as a poet in residence at Colgate University, upstate New York. Mm-hmm. And after that, I was doing like residency hopping. So I was going through residencies, quite a few residencies, like 7 or 8.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, in the U.S. And that was a fabulous experience for me. And I was also able to, support myself and living on like $2,000 or $3,000 a year or something. And that was sort of fun. And then I was sort of a little bit sick of it because it's sort of, you have 2 months or 7 weeks or 9 weeks here and there in between, you're staying with friends and so forth. Yeah. I thought, I really need to root somewhere.
Yeah, there's the exile life right there.
Yeah, because for me, I really need to have, the space, have a routine, have a very boring life and not going out or not hanging out with a lot of people if I'm really immersed in a particular piece. So I found it at times a little bit frustrating. And then, so I was looking at fellowships. And so I got 2 fellowships in Germany. So I was the Humboldt Fellowship, and I was doing research as an editor on German, Chinese, and American poetry. And then I got another fellowship. I think writers should apply. So there was the Académie Schloss Solitude. There was the Solitude. So basically, you are living in a castle with other artists of different disciplines.
It's amazing. So from a cattle ranch to a castle.
A castle, yeah. Oh. And you have your own studio in the castle. And I think the deadline is the end of this month. So I think, other artists out there should apply.
Yeah. And I'll live it up in a castle.
Yeah. So I did that. And at that time, one of my great mentors died in the U.S. Oh. And I thought, it's awful for me. And I thought that's also really a signal for me to go on my own way, not just in poetry, but also in life, really to go my own way. So I thought, okay, why not, to be in Europe and to really understand some of the sources of European and American poetry. I think it's like Pound said Merwin should go to France to study the troubadours, right? I think where the source language is, and I thought that's an interesting thing. That's also quite inspiring thing to hear. So I thought, okay, I love also the other languages, and you have one lifetime, so I'm not giving up, English or Chinese. I think maybe I'm just expanding myself with, stumbling to expand myself.
Well, I suppose this isn't a very genius point. It's quite obvious, but going from English into German and French, those are all languages in the same little, family tree. So at least it's not as radical a leap as Chinese to English.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. If you're doing professional translation or literary translation, you'll notice that you'll have more pages if you're translating a piece of Chinese literature. If it's 25 pages, then you end up with 45 pages of English.
Yeah. Yeah, concise language. I have a pal, well, he's a pal? A guy who's in the writer's workshop I go to, who's been successful with his children's lit book, and he's written it in English. It's not massive, but he has to, his editors told him he's got to cut it down by 20%. And the only reason is because they want to translate it into German, and it's going to inflate with the translation.
Okay. Yeah, I think the Germans really, logic is very important in a sense. So for the language, I think it's sort of also like precise, but sometimes abstract, not very physical language.
Yeah.
And so every language has, its own qualities, and I feel like, but everything, every language is pointing to the language, the language that we all share. I think that's something I'm sort of going after, to experience, the different forms and of that language and how it folds out in this time in history and in a different form. So I really love just basic words, not necessarily like I love a particular language. I love these, French, German, and English, Chinese, these languages, but also just words.
Absolutely.
Basic words, right? These are the common treasure, I think, and to be part of it, to use it, and to cherish it, not to abuse it, fight for it. I think that gives me a great feeling.
Hell yeah. Actually, what you said about German being logical, it reminded me, so I did German in school for 6 years. It's mostly forgotten now, but a thing I liked about German was the spelling, how it followed rules, unlike English spelling. And then the next language I learned to any degree was Chinese, and my favorite thing about pinyin is that, yeah, it's like German. The spelling doesn't mess around like English spelling does.
Yeah, that's great. So we have some, common languages.
Yeah, ein bisschen. But really, my German is so faded that my Chinese is better than my German now, and my Chinese isn't great. So, anyway. Sorry, were you going to say something?
They will come.
Yeah. Over time, for sure. And I notice if I'm inside Germany, my German gets like twice as good. Things come back that have, been sleeping.
Yeah. Just a word on the German language. I think the nouns are very proud because they're capitalized.
Yeah.
They're proud in the language, right? And they also use it as, it almost has a verb feeling to it. And also I think the German adjectives, they're not cluttered as English adjectives sometimes. Because you have a lot of choices, and sometimes you have the adjectives that sort of clutter the sentence.
Interesting. So my next question is totally unrelated to everything we've just been talking about. So this is something I might be looking at in my dissertation that's coming up. So do you think that given the China, especially the People's Republic of China, it's got a rising kind of status in the world, we're hearing more about it in the news over here, and so on, do you think that's having an effect on what kind of Chinese writing is reaching English language readers?
I don't necessarily think it has, right now it has an immediate effect yet. But I think there is a sort of growing sense of interest. I also work with publishers and agents a little bit, and I do notice that the rights situation is still not great. It's still very hard to sell Chinese authors in Europe or in the U.S.
Right.
So it's just growing, and I think it really has to do with the lack of great translators, because the translation in China, in particular, it's not paid well. It's not really respected, and so it's very hard to find really excellent translators, and I think it's the same case in the U.S. or in Germany. It's really hard to find translators, and translators could not really survive by literary translation. Most of them cannot.
Right.
So it's difficult.
I remember, so on my course, the only time anyone talked to me about buying and selling books rights between China, it was about academic publishing. So I asked my teacher, who's a German teacher, a postgrad student, a PhD student, I asked her, do the academic publishers have any trouble, since rights are a little bit different in China with the Western world? And she said, no, it's no problem. But I suppose academic writing's one thing, and trade fiction books are a totally different thing.
Yeah, it's a different beast, because I think a lot of academic books in Europe, and particularly, they're pretty expensive. So usually they have, I think it's subsidized by the writer itself or by the university. So it's not meant for the common audience.
Yeah. So on the note of interesting kinds of Chinese writing reaching the Western world, the thing that really got me interested in all this stuff was probably when I first heard about Santi, the Three-Body Problem by Liu Cixin, and then noticing the other books translated by his translator, Ken Liu, that were starting to pop up in bookshops. And online I'm seeing, maybe it's because of where I look online, but there seems to be, if not an increasing amount of coverage, at least these things consistently are being covered in English. Mm-hmm. So have you read any of these Chinese sci-fi books, and do you have any thoughts about them?
I have not read any of the sci-fi books, but I do know they're getting super popular in the States. And also getting very popular in Germany. I also know the two translators for his Santi books here in Germany. So I think it's a fabulous thing. It's sci-fi. It's it's the general literature, but I do think that's a great thing that's happening to China and to Chinese authors. Mm-hmm. So it will be the beginning, and I also hope that people will have more interest also in literature, in more serious literature, and but I don't have any opinion on the sci-fi books.
I can say a thing I liked about them was that, so maybe something you and Zhu Zhu would appreciate too, is that although they've become popular in the West, they're not taking they're not taking a political view that Western audiences would soak up, about how awful everything in China is. But on the other hand, they do have some interesting commentary and dimensions, and all from kind of a Chinese perspective. They're not massively political books at all, but that element's there, and in an interesting way. And that's all I'll say without spoiling it.
Okay, that's great. So maybe I should read those books at some point.
Yeah, and there's one I just finished reading recently. It's a collection put together by Ken Liu, and he's got a big intro. And in the intro, he does talk about ways Western audiences might be tempted to read the stories in all the ways you might expect. And he says, "Here's why you shouldn't do that." And it kind of meshes with even things I was seeing in Zhu Zhu's poetry. So I think, for people who are getting read in both places or working in translation, there seems to be this, I don't know, based on what I've seen, there's an awareness that there's like certain cliches that really ought to be avoided if you want to get a full appreciation of what Chinese writers are writing.
Exactly. And also I have sort of 2 points, right? I think serious literature could also be popular. Being popular does not necessarily mean it does not have literary merits, right? That would be my view, and I hope books, good books should be successful, good, I think as long as they're good books, right?
Sure.
And the other thing, I think people, who have, certain assumptions about China or Chinese literature, I hope they will, have the opportunity. Now, China is really sending, supporting authors to come overseas. And I hope they will actually have the opportunity to meet those authors, right? To speak to them and maybe through an interpreter to really have a real experience with them, I think, or go to China, have an experience to see for themselves, to judge for themselves, right? And I think that will be more interesting. That will add an interesting layer to their reading experience.
I've forgotten her name, but there was at least one Chinese author in that collection, Invisible Planets, because the stories are ordered author by author.
Okay.
It's terrible. I don't have the book in front of me. I forgot her name, but she's an academic as well as a writer of stories, and she's bilingual. So if she were to go over to, say, the States and give do an author event, she wouldn't even need a translator. She could speak directly to her Western fans. But anyway, I'm waffling. So as a final question, because we're about reaching 45 minutes now, which is usually about how long the shows last.
Sure.
Yeah, we've been talking almost an hour. Crazy. Do you have any books in any language, but probably especially English, that you'd like to recommend to listeners of the show? I don't know how many listeners we have, but for past, present, and future listeners, what would you recommend?
I mean, I would recommend probably first Lauren Niederger, an American poet who died, right? Who lived a miserable life and probably a little bit happy toward the end of her life. I think she's a fantastic poet and not so recognized. She was in the so-called objectivist school of poetry. And so she would be a fantastic poet too. I actually, at Deep Springs, after I read Lauren Niederger, I thought, well, maybe I should also try to become an American poet.
I'm sure they'd have you.
Yeah, and then I would recommend sort of one of my mentors and C.D. Wright, who died a few years ago. And so any books by C.D. Would be great. And of course, the Rosemary, Keith Wardrobe, Forrest Gander. These are.
Was that the guy you mentioned earlier?
Who died?
Yeah.
That's C.D. Yeah, C.D. Wright. Yeah. So she's. I think she's one of the. To my mind, one of the greatest poets in American poetry. And actually, I've been compiling a trilingual anthology in response to one of her poems after she died. So this thing will be published in China and most probably also in Germany.
Cool. And just since it's what the show's about, is there anything that's been translated from Chinese to English that you could recommend for the listeners?
From the Chinese into English?
Yeah.
Poetry, prose.
Sorry?
Poetry or prose?
Well, since you're a poet, maybe poetry, but feel free to name some prose as well if you like.
Zephyr Press has been doing a lot of Chinese poetry in partnership with University of Hong Kong. So they're introducing a series of books by Chinese poets for the past few years. So if you're really interested in Chinese poetry, so there are a lot of poets in that series. So that's quite interesting. And I think translations by Jeffrey Yang. I really like many of his translations. He recently translated a prose book by the Chinese poet Bei Dao. And, like some of Jeffrey Yang's work. I mean, he's also a poet, and his own works I really admire, and also his translations. He's also a fabulous editor.
If I remember right, didn't Jeffrey Yang translate one of the phoneme books, the Uyghurland one?
Exactly. He translated the Uyghur one, and he translated Liu Xiaobo's notes, and he also translated the great Song Dynasty poet Zhu Zhu.
Oh, that's quite a set right there. Well,
and also David Hinton. David Hinton is also classical poetry. I mean, he's one of the best translators.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for your recommendations and for all your time. I think I'm all out of questions. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. It's a beautiful chat. I hope you have good weather on your side.
Somehow, even in Scotland, yes, we have managed to get good weather.
Okay.
Who knows how long it will last, but it's I've been for this whole chat. I've been looking out the window and I've been looking at blue skies. Somehow, It's a miracle.
That's great. Okay.
Okay, so have a great day.
Okay, you too. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Aye. Toodaloo. So that was me talking to Dong Li, translator of The Wild Great Wall, and honestly, what a swell guy, what a fab guy. Really enjoyed that chat. So that's episode 6 reached its end now. So just to reiterate those plugs I gave at the start, you can help support the show on our Patreon. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Watch out for a PayPal where you could give a one-off donation. I'll have that ready pretty soon as well. And I'll put a link to Phony Media, the publishers of The Wild Great Wall, in the show notes, as well as, well, perhaps any other little bonus nuggets I can find. In any case, thank you everyone for listening. Please do subscribe. Please tell anyone who might be interested in the show that they can find us on iTunes or any other major podcast provider. And until then, until next time, 再见.